What would you do if you had to face an army of over 100,000 men with only 300 warriors by your side? Sounds crazy, right? But this isn't a fictional story. It's one of the most extraordinary battles ever fought in the history of humanity. Imagine this. The year is 480 BC. The greatest empire the world had ever seen is marching to conquer Greece. On one side, a Persian army so vast that, according to ancient accounts, their arrows could block out the sun. On the other side, only 300 Spartans, led by a king who knew he was marching towards death. But what would drive men to accept a suicide mission? And why is this battle, even though it happened over 2,500 years ago, still considered one of the greatest examples of courage and sacrifice in history? Today, we're diving into a story where bravery defied the impossible, a battle that changed the course of Western civilization and defined the meaning of the word heroism. You've probably heard of the 300 Spartans. Maybe you've even seen the movie. But the real story is even more impressive and more brutal than Hollywood could ever portray. In the following pages of history, you will uncover secrets that few people know. How did a small group of warriors manage to hold back the largest army of the ancient world? What were the actual numbers of soldiers on both sides? And why might the sacrifice of these men have saved Western democracy before it even existed? Get ready for a journey to the pass of Thermopylae, where every drop of blood spilled wrote a lesson in courage that echoes to this day. This is the true story of the 300 Spartans, a tale of loyalty, strategy, and ultimate sacrifice. Imagine an empire so vast that it would take months to cross it on horseback. From Egypt to the gates of India, from the waters of the Aegean Sea to the sands of Persia, this was the colossal Persian Empire of the 6th century BC, a giant whose very name made the ancient world tremble. But even the greatest empires have their weak points. Like a small crack in an apparently indestructible wall, a rebellion began to brew. In 499 BC, something extraordinary happened. The Greek cities of Asia Minor, led by a man named Aristagoras, did the unthinkable. Imagine the audacity. They not only defied Persian power, but marched all the way to Sardis, the heart of Persian authority in the region, and set its sacred temples on fire. It was like slapping the king himself in the face. Time passed, and a new ruler took the Persian throne, Xerxes, son of Darius. And Xerxes was not a man who easily forgot insults against his family. In the spring of 480 BC, he did something that would leave the ancient world in awe. He assembled the largest army that had ever walked the earth. Picture a force as diverse as it was powerful. Persians in colorful garments, Medes with their legendary bows, Babylonians in golden armor, Egyptians with exotic weapons, and warriors from as far away as the distant lands of India. To grasp the scale of this army, imagine the entire population of a modern city marching together. Ancient sources speak of numbers so astonishing they seem straight out of an epic tale. Hundreds of thousands of men marching under the same banner, accompanied by a naval fleet that made the sea look covered with ships as far as the eye could see. But Xerxes wasn't just seeking conquest, he wanted revenge. His father had suffered two bitter humiliations, the burning of Sardis and the defeat at Marathon. It was time to wash the royal family's honor with Greek blood. The goal was clear and ambitious, to turn proud Greece into just another province of the vast Persian Empire. When these news reached Sparta, it was like a thunderbolt from a clear sky. The Greek leaders knew they were facing an impossible choice. Sparta, renowned for turning its men into war machines from childhood, faced a unique dilemma. Their devotion to the gods sometimes conflicted with their military obligations. It was like being caught between a rock and a hard place. Honor the gods or defend the homeland. Now imagine the irony of fate. In 490 BC, when Athens cried for help against the Persians at the Battle of Marathon, the Spartan warriors were bound by their hands. The reason? They were celebrating festivals in honor of the god Apollo, and abandoning the celebrations would be like spitting in the face of the gods. For a people as devout as they were warrior-like, it was a heartbreaking dilemma. But now, 10 years later, with even darker clouds of war on the horizon, something extraordinary happened. In the majestic temple of Poseidon in Corinth, representatives of the Greek city-states gathered to do something unprecedented, take a sacred oath of unity against the Persian invader. Thus, the Hellenic League was born. Even though only a handful of cities joined the pact, they knew the moment of truth had arrived. Like a chess player planning his moves ahead, the Greeks realized that their only chance lay in the narrow mountain passes. There, in that treacherous terrain, David could face Goliath. In a tense and decisive meeting, the Greek leaders devised a daring plan. They wouldn't try to match the enemy's numbers. That was impossible. Instead, they would use every stone, every curve of the terrain they knew so well to their advantage. To lead this nearly impossible mission, they chose one man, Leonidas, the king of Sparta. The farewell between Leonidas and his wife, Gorgo, would become legendary. With words that would echo through the centuries, she told him, "Come back with your shield or on it," a poetic way of saying, return victorious or dead with honor. Leonidas, a natural leader known for both his wisdom and bravery, selected 300 of his best warriors. But he didn't choose just any soldiers. He specifically chose men who already had sons, ensuring that their lineage would continue continue even if they did not return. The selection process was brutal. Imagine the most lethal warriors you've ever heard of. Now multiply that by 10. The candidates, all between the ages of 20 and 29, had to prove not just their physical strength and skill with weapons, but something even rarer, a courage that bordered on the supernatural. Because these men weren't just heading into battle, they were marching into what they knew was a suicide mission. The army grew as thousands of soldiers from other Greek cities joined, reaching approximately 7,000 men. But before their departure, there was one last crucial stop, the Oracle of Delphi. In the sacred temple, shrouded in mystical vapors, the Pythia, priestess of Apollo, delivered a prophecy that chilled everyone present. Either your grand city will be destroyed by the descendants of Perseus, or a king from the line of Hercules must die. It was as if the gods themselves were placing Sparta's fate on the scales. Imagine the weight on Leonidas's shoulders as he deciphered that devastating prophecy. To save his beloved Sparta, he would have to die in battle. It was like a chess player realizing he needed to sacrifice his king to protect the kingdom. With this grim revelation echoing in his mind, he began to prepare the defense that would go down in history. The core of the Greek strategy lay in something revolutionary for its time, the hoplites. Picture a human wall of bronze and bravery, where each warrior fought not just for himself, but for everyone around him. Each soldier carried a massive shield called a hoplon, not merely to protect himself, but also his comrade to the left. It was like a perfect puzzle, where each piece protected the next, creating a living wall of metal and muscle known as the phalanx. Thermopylae, meaning hot gates due to its thermal springs, was not chosen by chance. Imagine a giant funnel of rock and sea. On one side, the largest army the world had ever seen. On the other, a handful of determined warriors in a narrow pass where numbers mattered less than courage and skill. It was as if nature itself had designed the perfect battlefield for the Greeks. In open ground, facing the Persians would be like trying to stop a tsunami with your bare hands. But at Thermopylae, it was different. There, the Persians would be forced to fight in a narrow corridor where their overwhelming numbers became almost a disadvantage. Leonidas, like a master architect, turned every inch of that pass into a fortress. His men built strategic walls and created defense points, transforming that natural corridor into a deadly trap for any invader. But the true genius of Leonidas lay not only in his military strategy. Like a maestro conducting an orchestra, he organized his men in shifts, ensuring that there were always rested warriors ready to fight. It was as if he had several teams of Olympic athletes, always fresh and prepared to leap into action. The Greek army was a patchwork of different city-states. Imagine a team composed of both professional athletes, the Spartans, and amateurs, the other cities, yet all united by a common goal. Leonidas knew he had to turn this diversity into strength. Like an inspirational coach, he worked to create a sense of unity among warriors who, in normal times, might have been rivals. As the Greek troops prepared for battle, they knew they were not just defending their cities, but the very soul of Greece. Each soldier had left behind a family, a home, and a life, carrying with him the weight of an entire civilization. Thermopylae was not just a battlefield, it was the last stand of a people refusing to be subjugated, a place where bravery would become legend. And at the heart of this legend was Leonidas, ready to face his destiny. On the other side of the pass came what seemed like the end of the world, the Persian army. Imagine an ocean of spears and shields advancing, soldiers from dozens of different nations, each with their own weapons and tactics, cavalry, archers, and the elite immortals, all under the command of the proud Xerxes, who watched his colossal force with the certainty of an inevitable victory. Little did he know he was about to face not just men, but living legends, warriors who would turn that narrow pass into the stage of one of the greatest stories of courage ever told. What was about to happen at Thermopylae would not just be a battle, it would become an eternal symbol of bravery and sacrifice. It was as if destiny itself had scheduled a meeting with history, and Leonidas's 300 were not going to be late. This confrontation would be a turning point, a moment that would define the meaning of resilience and honor for all future generations. The first encounter was merely a preview of what was to come. When the Persian scouts spotted the small Greek army, they likely thought it would be an easy victory, but they quickly realized their mistake. It was like a lion encountering a venomous snake in a narrow alley. Size does not always determine the winner. The Greeks, led by Leonidas, had that gleam in their eyes that only warriors ready to die possess. They knew that even against a giant, they held two powerful weapons, the perfect terrain and unmatched combat skills. In the days leading up to the battle, something extraordinary happened. While most armies would prepare with somber prayers and tearful farewells, the Spartans did something surprising. They began grooming themselves as if they were getting ready for a festival. Imagine warriors combing their long hair, polishing their armor until it shone like a mirror, as if they were preparing for a party, not for death. It was the Spartans' unique way of saying to death, "We do not fear you. In fact, we are dressing up to meet you." Leonidas, like an experienced coach selecting his team for the championship final, positioned his Spartan warriors at the front lines. It was like placing his most valuable players at the most critical moment. front. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were true athletes of war, men who, since childhood, had been molded for this moment. Each Spartan was like a piece of pure gold on a chessboard, perfectly placed to cause maximum impact. Alongside them, the other Greeks, perhaps less experienced but equally determined, formed a human wall of bronze and courage. United by the same spirit of resistance, they turned their differences into collective strength. Each one knew they were about to face an enemy that could overwhelm them in numbers. But no Persian could match the heart of the Greek warriors that day. And so, as the sun rose over Thermopylae, casting its shadows over that narrow corridor of rock and sea, the two armies faced off. On one side, an endless mass of Persian soldiers, a dark cloak covering the horizon. On the other, a thin but firm line of Greek warriors, their armor shining like stars under the morning sun. This was the moment of truth. What began as a meeting of leaders in Corinth now culminated in an epic clash that would echo through the ages. The fate of men and nations intertwined in that narrow pass. Thermopylae would become more than just a battlefield. It would become a shrine of sacrifice where the human spirit would defy the impossible. The Persian army arrived like a storm on the horizon, an endless mass of men and weapons that seemed to swallow the very landscape. Xerxes, seated on his golden throne, watched with the arrogance of someone who had never tasted defeat. It was like a chess player who only knew easy victories, now about to face a master strategist on an unfamiliar board. Confident in his overwhelming superiority, Xerxes decided to be merciful. Like a predator toying with its prey, he sent a messenger with what he considered a generous offer. The scene that followed would go down in history. Imagine a Persian diplomat, draped in gold and silk, approaching a group of warriors covered in bronze, sweat, and raw determination. With a voice trained in luxurious courts, the messenger presented Xerxes' offer as if delivering a precious gift. The great king, in his infinite mercy, offers you your lives. Lay down your weapons, swear loyalty to the Persian Empire, and you shall live. The silence that followed was deafening. All eyes turned to Leonidas. Then, like a thunderclap on a clear day, came the response that would echo through the centuries. Leonidas, with a faint smile on his lips, uttered two words that would become immortal. Molon Labe, come and take them. It was more than just a reply. It was a declaration of war, a cry of freedom, a challenge that would resonate across millennia. In that moment, everyone understood that they were witnessing not just a battle, but the birth of a legend. Those two words from Leonidas, Molon Lub, were more than a simple refusal. It was like a declaration of independence written in bronze and courage. Imagine the scene, a small band of warriors, outnumbered at least 100 to 1, having the audacity to challenge the greatest empire the world had ever seen. It was as if David were not only facing Goliath, but provoking him with a smile. This response was not mere bravado. It was the confidence of someone who knew his terrain and his strategy as well as the back of his hand. When the messenger returned with the answer, Xerxes reacted like a spoiled child, hearing no for the first time. The great king, accustomed to seeing entire nations bow at his command, was now faced with a defiance he had never imagined. His arrogance was met with a calm, unyielding resistance, setting the stage for a confrontation that would be remembered for ages. Xerxes now faced a handful of men who dared to defy him. Furious, he made his first great mistake, ordering a frontal assault. What happened next was like witnessing a deadly ballet, where every move had been rehearsed thousands of times. The Spartans moved as a single organism, their shields forming an impenetrable wall of bronze. Leonidas didn't need to shout orders. His mere presence was a beacon of confidence for his men. It was as if each warrior could feel the heartbeat of his companion beside him, pounding in unison. The moment of impact was brutal. Imagine a giant wave crashing against a cliff, but this time, the cliff was armed with spears. The Persians, used to overwhelming their enemies with superior numbers, encountered something they had never faced before, a shield wall so perfectly coordinated that it seemed unbreakable. Their weapons bounced off uselessly, while the Greek spears found their targets with deadly precision. It was like trying to force an entire army through a narrow doorway, simply impossible. Hours dragged on, and the Persians continued to send wave after wave of soldiers, like a desperate gambler betting all his chips. Even the immortals, the Persian elite who carried that name because they always maintained exactly 10,000 men, immediately replacing any fallen, could not break through the defense. The Greeks rotated with the precision of a Swiss clock. While some rested, others held the line, ensuring the defense never weakened. The battlefield turned into a Persian graveyard. Each failed assault added to the pile of bodies in front of the Greek wall, creating a macabre barrier of flesh and metal. Xerxes, watching from his golden throne, was in disbelief. It was as if he were witnessing an impossible nightmare, his invincible army being humiliated by a group he could almost count on his fingers. For every Greek that fell, dozens of Persians met their end on Spartan spears. The morale of the Persians began to melt away like snow in the desert, while the Greeks, though exhausted and wounded, kept that fierce gleam in their eyes. Every minute of resistance was a victory. Every fallen Persian was a testament that even the greatest of empires could bleed. This was more than just a battle. It was a lesson in how determination and and courage could defy the impossible. Strategy and courage could overcome even the greatest of adversities. The first day of battle had ended, but the frustration in the Persian camp was palpable, like the dense air before a storm. Xerxes, the man who considered himself a living god, was being challenged by a handful of warriors in a narrow pass. It was like watching a giant unable to crush an ant, humiliating and bewildering. It was in this moment of vulnerability that fate dealt its hand through a man named Ephialtes, a name that would become synonymous with betrayal in Greek history. Imagine the scene: a local Greek, driven by greed and the promise of wealth, sneaking into the Persian royal tent. Like a serpent whispering venomous secrets, Ephialtes revealed something that would change the course of the battle. A hidden path, concealed among the mountains like an ancient scar, known only to local shepherds and hunters. It was as if he had discovered a backdoor to an otherwise impenetrable fortress. For Xerxes, it was like receiving a gift from the gods themselves. Without wasting time, the Persian king assigned his most lethal warriors to this mission, the Immortals, under the command of Hydarnes. It was like sending wolves on a silent, deadly night hunt. Meanwhile, completely unaware of the unfolding betrayal, the Greeks prepared for yet another day of heroic resistance. The rising sun found them in formation once more, like unwitting actors in a tragedy whose script had already been written. The first hours of that fateful day followed the script of the previous one. The Persians attacking like waves crashing against a cliff, the Greeks holding their ground like immovable rocks. Leonidas and his men continued to prove that courage and discipline could overcome superior numbers. It was like witnessing a deadly dance whose steps everyone already knew. Then came the moment that changed everything. Like a lightning bolt splitting the clear sky, the news arrived from Greek scouts. Persian troops had been spotted moving through the mountains. It was as if they had discovered a fatal crack in the walls of an impregnable castle. Leonidas gathered his commanders for an urgent war council. The situation was crystal clear. They were about to be surrounded. Here's the passage translated into English. It was at this moment that one of the most heroic decisions in military history was born. Like a captain who chooses to sink with his ship to save the crew, Leonidas ordered most of the troops to withdraw, but he and his 300 Spartans, along with a few allies as brave as they were, mainly the Thespians who refused to abandon their brothers in arms, chose to stay. It was as if they were signing their own death sentence, but with pride and purpose. That night at Thermopylae had a different air. While the Persian army silently closed in from behind, like a predator circling its prey, the warriors who chose to remain strengthened their positions. The mood among them was not one of defeat or fear, but of a strange peace, the serenity that comes with the acceptance of fate and the certainty of a greater purpose. Each man there knew that his death would buy precious time for Greece to prepare. Every minute of resistance was an investment in the future of their civilization. It was as though those warriors could already hear the echoes of their story through the centuries, not as men who died, but as eternal symbols of courage and sacrifice. As they sharpened their weapons and adjusted their armor, it was not just for one last battle, but for their entry into immortality. As the sun set, casting a shadow over the pass at Thermopylae, the brave Greek warriors prepared for their final fight. Leonidas and his 300 Spartans, along with their valiant allies, knew their mission was to ensure their sacrifice would not be in vain. Despite the certainty of imminent defeat, their morale remained high, for they understood that their act of bravery would give the other Greek forces the time they needed to organize and prepare for the future battles. As the echoes of clashing swords and war cries filled the narrow passages, the Greek soldiers positioned themselves firmly, ready to sell their lives as dearly as possible. They knew the Persian army would soon engulf them, but they would not stand idly by, awaiting their fate. With determination in their eyes and fire in their souls, they prepared for the final clash, ready to honor their families and cities with one glorious last stand. At dawn on the third day, the Spartans and their allies prepared for the final battle. The narrow pass of Thermopylae still worked in their favor, forcing the Persians to fight in a confined space where their massive numbers didn't give them such an advantage. The battle began like the roar of thunder. The Persians, determined to crush that small force once and for all, attacked with all the fury and desperation of a cornered animal. But the Spartans and their allies fought with a supernatural ferocity, every strike of their swords and spears carrying the weight of their cause. It was a deadly dance, and the steps were simple: survive as long as possible, inflict as much damage as they could, and take as many enemies with them as possible. The hours passed, and the battlefield became a sea of blood and bodies. The Greeks, exhausted and bleeding, kept resisting. Each soldier was like a wall by themselves, facing dozens of enemies before falling. The Thespians, those who had chosen to stay by the Spartans, fought with equal bravery, knowing their choice to die there would place them alongside the heroes of history. The Persians, frustrated and increasingly fearful, faced an enemy who seemed not to fear death. Finally, surrounded on all sides, the last Greek defenders were reduced to a small group. Leonidas, already covered in wounds, fell, but his death was the spark for a final burst of fury among the survivors. They charged in a desperate last attack, breaking their weapons against enemy shields, fighting with their bare hands hands when necessary. It was as though the very land of Thermopylae was resisting, channeling the spirit of those men. And then silence. When the last warrior fell, the Persians stood over the battlefield, victorious but exhausted, looking with respect and fear at the bodies of the Spartans and their allies. There, in the narrow pass that had witnessed one of the most legendary battles in history, lay the example of resistance that could not be measured in numbers but in courage and sacrifice. The sacrifice of the 300 and their allies was not in vain. Their actions delayed the Persian advance and gave time for the Greek city-states to unite and prepare a coordinated defense. The bravery shown at Thermopylae would inspire the Greeks at Salamis and Plataea, where they would ultimately defeat Xerxes' army. History would tell and retell the feat of these men, turning them into symbols of resistance and freedom. Even in defeat, they achieved eternal victory in the memory and hearts of those who sought an example of courage in the face of the impossible. Where their superior numbers did not give them a decisive advantage, the Greeks formed a compact offensive line and awaited the attack. The battle was fierce and bloody. Even with the advantage of the secret path revealed by a traitor, the Persians encountered heroic resistance. Leonidas, always at the forefront of his men, directed each movement with precision, knowing that every minute gained was vital. Finally, the Spartan king fell, surrounded by his loyal men. The Spartans, famous for their resilience and discipline, made the Persians pay dearly for every inch of ground they gained. Even the Thespians and Thebans, less trained, fought bravely, inspired by the example of the Spartans. After Leonidas's death, a fierce struggle broke out over his body. Although the Greeks managed to recover it, the Persian king Xerxes, enraged, ordered it to be decapitated and displayed on a pole. Days later, the Spartans buried his remains at the site. 40 years later, Sparta honored Leonidas with a state funeral, erecting a stele with his name and that of the 300 fallen Spartans. A temple near the Acropolis would become the center of annual celebrations in his memory, considered a semi-divine hero. The Battle of Thermopylae cost the lives of more than 20,000 elite Persian soldiers in just 3 days. The Battle of Thermopylae was a moment of courage and sacrifice, but it also revealed the vulnerability of Xerxes' army and navy. This glimpse of weakness inspired the Greeks to unite and fight bravely in the battles of Salamis a month later and Plataea a year later. These victories were not just military triumphs. They marked the end of the Persian invasion and forever changed the course of Greek and Western history. At Salamis, the cunning of the Greek commanders shone through, demonstrating that a well-crafted naval strategy could defeat even the most powerful enemy. Meanwhile, at Plataea, the resistance and unity of the Greek warriors ensured a decisive victory on solid ground, ending the Persian threat once and for all. These events not only solidified Greece's strength, but also ignited the flame of freedom for other oppressed nations. Each battle represented a step toward the building of a legacy of democracy and resistance that still resonates today. Here's the translation for your closing statement. This video was created for the History Explorer channel, and we hope you enjoyed this story from one of the most epic moments in ancient Greece. If you liked it, give us a like, share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe to the Historia Sem Limites channel for more fascinating content about our past. See you in the next video.